You're listening to Dr. Ron Charles of the Cubit Foundation, an international humanitarian organization teaching the historical truths and good news of Jesus Christ all around the world. Today's message is entitled, Withered Hand. And now, let's join Dr. Ron Charles.
Okay, Luke, the 6th chapter. Turn with me, if you will. The thing about archaeology, as well as history, is that it allows us to share events that are typically not knowledgeable on the average, everyday stories about Jesus. And unfortunately, for us as Americans, I hate to say it, but it's absolutely true, that most of our information about Jesus in America comes from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and 20th Century Fox, from Hollywood. And this is why many times, or most times, in the Christian congregations, that pastors speak a lot about the letters of Paul, about the Psalms and Proverbs and various Old Testament scriptures and so forth, because they get the feeling, and rightly so, that most Christians say that they know about Jesus. And the reason why they know about Jesus is because they saw him on TV. And you talk about Jesus every Easter, every Christmas, but unfortunately, Hollywood doesn't go out on the limb to do an extensive amount of research on the life of Jesus. They pad that history quite often, and unfortunately for us as Christians, we believe it, and we don't do the research necessary to confirm what they say is true. And so tonight we're going to be talking about an event that some of you perhaps have heard messages on. Others of you perhaps have not. Because this is considered one of the minor events of Jesus' ministry. Now, the Lord corrected me on this a number of years ago. Because He corrected me by saying there is nothing that is minor in my ministry and in my life. My sacrifice for mankind is on a level by itself. But outside of that, everything in the life of Jesus is of equal importance. Whether you're talking about the resurrection of Lazarus, or whether you're talking about the event where the Galileans were slaughtered where the blood was mixed with the sacrifice when Pontius Pilate killed them. A very minor event that you never hear sermons about. But still, in the life of Jesus, everything is of equal importance. And this particular event is one of those events that we normally don't hear a lot about, but yet it's still just as important in Jesus' life. And we're going to begin to read in verse number 6 of chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 6 says this, And it came to pass also on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. Now this withered is xena endosia. It's a Greek word that meant the dried out hand of a stonemason. Okay. So let's continue. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they might find an accusation against him. And he knew their thoughts, and said to the man which had the withered hand, Rise up, and stand forth in the midst. And he arose and stood forth. Then said Jesus unto them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? And looking round about upon them, he said unto the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored whole as the other. And they, meaning the Pharisees and scribes who were there, and they were filled with madness, and communed one with another what they might do to Jesus. Now, when we first read this particular event, it sounds like any other miracle that Jesus has ministered. A man had a withered hand, and Jesus healed him, which is a great miracle. But when we look at the background information concerning this great miracle, it becomes even more of an exciting event in Jesus' life. Because let's go back to the beginning of this particular event. And the beginning of this event has to go back all the way back to the time of Herod the Great. This was about 30 years or so before this time. Now, Herod the Great was hated by the Jewish people. He was their king, true. He had been appointed king by Augustus Caesar, so he was under the jurisdiction of Caesar, the Roman emperor, but he was still the king of the Jews. But Herod was a very ruthless man. He was bloodthirsty, and he was crazy. He flew off the handle and went into rages, killing hundreds of people at a time. And because of this, he was feared and hated by his own people. Now, in order to get on their good side, Herod did many things to try to buy their friendship. Now, many of you know people like that, try to buy friendships, that their own personality is worthless, so they want to buy you. And so this is what Herod did. He tried to buy the friendship of the Jewish people. And he did this by keeping them employed and various other things. But one of the greatest things that Herod did to try to buy the friendship of the Jewish people was to build a temple. And this is called Herod's temple. This is the same temple where Jesus worshipped and the apostles worshipped and so forth. It was a great, great, great accomplishment. Now, in my opinion, the Herod's temple should have been the eighth wonder of the ancient world. And again, in my opinion, the ninth wonder of the world is the fact that it was not the eighth wonder. I mean, it was a magnificent facility and a tremendous structure that was probably the most beautiful structure in that part of the world. And it was just magnificent. And Herod received permission from Augustus Caesar to spare no expense. Any money that you wanted to spend, anything that you wanted to put into this temple was fine. And Herod did that. He spared no expenses. There was a priest that Herod the Great appointed to be the construction manager of the temple of Herod. And this construction manager's name, this priest's name, was Yeshua Binsi. Yeshua was, we would pronounce it Joshua, but at that time they called it Yeshua Binsi. And so Yeshua Binsi was a priest, and he was responsible not only for the construction but also for the appointment of the master construction personnel that were going to be involved with the temple. Herod wanted the very best stonemasons in the world. Yeshua Binsi went all over the Roman Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, to try to find the very best stonemasons or stone workers to be the technicians for this great masterpiece that Herod was building. And just so happened that after many years of research, that Yeshua Binsi discovered that the very best stonemasons in that part of the world were right there in Judea, in the Judea-Galilee area. And so he chose 217 stonemasons to be responsible for the stonework on the superstructure and the substructure of this temple. And so he went to work, and they were doing a remarkable job, a tremendous job of construction. But Herod began to get a premonition that he was going to die before the work on the temple was complete. And rightly so, he did die. But because of this premonition, he demanded of Yeshua ben Si that the stonemasons were to work around the clock in shifts of 8 hours apiece, 24 hours a day, including the Sabbath day. So Yeshua ben Si went to Eleazar, who was the high priest at that time, and he told him that Herod had commanded this, so they really had no alternative. That the priests, that the stonemasons were commanded to work even on the Sabbath day. Okay, Eleazar said, that's okay, since we're working for the temple of God, and I give you my permission. But he didn't have much choice anyway, Pastor. He had to do it. And so the stonemasons began to work around the clock in shifts of 8 hours, and they even worked on the Sabbath day. Well, Herod died before it was complete. He died in 4 BC. And so his successor, his son, continued the same policy. And the stonemasons continued to work around the clock, even with Herod's successor, and even on the Sabbath day, until the work was complete. So the substructure and the superstructure was complete, and there was going to be a great celebration with the completion of their work. But the Roman governor had other ideas. He said this. He said, the Tower of Antonia is not complete. And the Tower of Antonia was located on the northwest section of the Temple Square, and that was going to be the headquarters of the Roman governor. He was going to be headquartered there. The Roman soldiers were going to be headquartered there at the fortress of Antonia, or the Tower of Antonia. And so the Roman governor says this: if your stonemasons can work around the clock and work on your Sabbath day on your temple, you most assuredly are going to work for me the same way. And so Yeshua ben Si went back to the high priest. The high priest at this time, Eleazar had died, and the new high priest was Eleazar. So he went to Eleazar and said, the Roman governor are demanding that our stonemasons work continually around the clock and to work on the Sabbath day for the Tower of Antonia. He said, we really have no choice. This is what the Roman governor is demanding. And so Eleazar issued a proclamation. This proclamation was called the Sabbath of Weeks. In history, it's called the Sabbath of Weeks. And with this proclamation, it gave the stonemasons a permission to work an additional 126 Sabbaths. And with those 126 Sabbaths, they estimated the work would be complete. And it happened. Within that time frame, within that 126 Sabbath days, with the stonemasons working around the clock, they did complete the work on the Tower of Antonia. Now, once it was all complete, the Sabbath after the completion of the Tower of Antonia was March the 2nd in the year 2 A.D. That was the Sabbath day. So on that day, Eleazar, also the chief priest, again, the high priest, again gave special permission for a great celebration to take place. So on this Sabbath day, he gave the permission to cook and to have a great feast and a celebration to honor these stonemasons for the great work that they had done. And so there was a great celebration called for this Sabbath day. Permission was granted to give the feast, the celebration right there in the temple courtyard. And so everyone was invited. The families of the stonemasons, the wives and the children, dignitaries from the various towns that they were from, different people were there to have this great celebration. At sunrise that Sabbath day, the celebration began. Yeshua ben Si stood up and he says, look at the great work that these stonemasons have done. They've done a remarkable job on this temple of God, and they're to be honored, and they're to be praised, they're to be exalted to the highest level. And they were. And there was so the celebration continued all morning long. At 12 o'clock noon, Yeshua ben Nisi again stood up. And he called his attention to everyone. And he says, again, I want to show you the great work that these stonemasons have done. And even though they had to work on the Sabbath day, which is against the law of Moses, it's against the law of God, but because they were working on the temple, then it was okay. And they will not be punished for breaking the law of Moses because they were working on the temple. But for working for the Romans on the Sabbath day, you will be punished. And with that, the right hands and the right arm of all 217 of the stonemasons were crushed. Along with that, the wives of these stonemasons had their right eye plucked out, their right hand cut off, their right foot cut off, and they were forced to work in Gehenna, the garbage dump of Jerusalem, for the rest of their lives. The children of these stonemasons had both of their eyes plucked out, both hands cut off, both feet cut off, and they were forced to beg in the streets of Jerusalem for the rest of their lives. And the stonemasons never again were allowed to see their wives or their families for the remainder of their lives. And then Eleazar, the high priest, made a proclamation. It's called the Zina Reposia, which is, in our terminology, called the stonemasons' disallowance. And in this proclamation, it says this, that these stonemasons became enemies of God because they had broken the Sabbath day by working for the Romans, the enemies of God. And because they did this, it would have been better for them to have refused to work, even with the permission of the high priest, didn't matter. It would have been better for them to refuse to work and die at the hands of the Romans than to break the law of the Sabbath. And because they broke the law of the Sabbath, then they become enemies of God, that God hated them. And there would never be any forgiveness of their sin in this life or the life to come. That they would never be friends of God, they would never be forgiven of God, and for the remainder of their lives, they would always be enemies of God, never receiving any forgiveness. And from that time forward, every Sabbath day, in the city of their home, they were to sit on the north wall of their synagogue every Sabbath day. And against this north wall, they would sit with their eyes pointed down. They were not allowed to look at people in the eyes. And around their arm would be wrapped a red cloth. And that red cloth was to identify them as being evil or enemies of God. And they were to sit there on the north wall all Sabbath day, every Sabbath day, and the leader of the synagogue would then use them as examples, and they would say every single Sabbath day, this is what God does to those people who he hates. This is what God does to those who break his laws. And this is what happens to those that God has no forgiveness for. And the stonemasons' disallowance went on to say this: if these stonemasons commit suicide to get out of the horror of their punishment, then their punishment would be passed down to their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren for 3 generations, and those people would then inherit their sin, and they would not receive a resurrection either. Now, these stonemasons, as well as the Jewish people of this time, felt like that the high priest was God's mouthpiece. They were speaking on behalf of God. That if the high priest said it, it was just like God saying it. And they claimed that they were God's mouthpiece, God's representatives. And so these stonemasons felt with all their heart that God was the one who is actually speaking through the high priest, and that God really did hate them, and that there was no forgiveness. It had now been about 30 years. By now, the stonemason's arm was all withered and dried up into nothing. And it was one of these 217 stonemasons who had been exampled by Yeshua ben C, who Jesus confronted on this particular Sabbath. Jesus knew why these guys were here. It wasn't a secret. These guys had been sitting in their various synagogues throughout Judea and Galilee for now 30 years. We don't know whether Jesus had ever seen this particular one or not. Perhaps not. But obviously Jesus had seen others, because it was common knowledge why they were there. They had been cursed by God. They had been in a position where God hated them, and they felt like it. Now put yourself in the position of this stonemason. For 30 years, there was no doubt in his mind that God hated him. That there would never be any forgiveness of his sin. He would not have a resurrection. He would never receive any type of hope in eternal life. There was no doubt in his mind, because the high priest said so, and the high priest was God's representative, God's mouthpiece. And so, to them, God himself had told them, you have no forgiveness. Can you imagine living under that type of pressure? You know, even in our state of sin, all of us before we got saved, we all knew that there was a God of love out there that cared for us. And even in our sinful state, we knew that he would forgive us. But this man, for the last 30 years, he didn't even have that assurance that he would ever be forgiven. He would never, ever receive a resurrection or forgiveness of his sin, because he was an enemy of God. But on this day, there would be a difference. Because Jesus visited this synagogue this day. And on this day, there was going to be something happen that would make ripples throughout the entire religious community. Now, these Pharisees, these scribes who were there, they had heard about this man Jesus. He had done things on the Sabbath day before. He had healed on the Sabbath day. He had taught on the Sabbath day. He had done things on the Sabbath day that really wasn't acceptable. But he did it, and that's okay. But surely, even Jesus wouldn't countermand a direct command of God through the mouth of the high priest. Even Jesus wouldn't do that. Even this rebel that he was, even he wouldn't countermand a direct proclamation from God. But Jesus made a direct reference to that very tragic day. That day, in verse number 9, it says this. Then said Jesus unto them, now I'll ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil? Is it lawful to give a celebration in honor of these men? Is it lawful to work on the Sabbath day for the temple, but yet to destroy a man's livelihood and a man's family on the Sabbath day? Is it lawful to save life or to destroy it on the same day? And then Jesus didn't wait for their answer. He told the man to stand up and to stretch forth his hand. And that man whose hand for more than 30 years had been shriveled up and destroyed, stretched it out. He was totally whole. But this was more than just a physical healing. Because what Jesus is telling these people there that day was this. This man is not an enemy of God. He was a victim of man's inhumanity to man. This man did not break the law of God. He is not hated of God. He is just a victim of cruelty. And you have made him a victim. You have placed him in this position. But I'm telling you that he is not an enemy of God. He is loved of God. And he, to show how much he is loved of God, that God has healed him totally and completely. You know, in our lives, there may be some of us here even tonight that you may feel that God has somehow let you down. Or maybe some preachers some time back at a sermon or a personal counseling thing says that you've done something to displease God. That's why you have this disease. That's why you have to go through this type of thing, this type of tragedy, this type of situation, because God is punishing you. That you're reaping what you sow, which is rightly so, but God doesn't punish by doing things like this. We do reap what we sow. There's no doubt about that. Okay? But God doesn't put this type of stuff on us as punishment. And maybe we've been told that thing. And perhaps for years we've been living under this condemnation that the reason why I'm having to go through this horror, this situation, this tragedy, that the reason why my prayer is not being answered is because I'm having to be punished for something that I did. I'm having to be punished for something that happened in my life. But I'm here tonight to tell you this. You are not an enemy of God, and you're not being punished. You could be a victim of man's inhumanity to man. You can be a victim of someone's jealousy. You can be a victim of circumstances. You very much could be a victim. But God is not your enemy. And God does not hate you. And God is not punishing you. He's your friend. He's your lover. And He wants you to realize tonight that it's not my fault that you're in this situation, and to show you just rely upon me and I will pull you out of this. Can you imagine the sense of relief this man had after 30 years of this type of horror, this type of trauma that he went through? This particular event was recorded by a Roman historian whose name was Tatianus. This particular man's name was Jonathan Marsilius. When Nero became emperor, he sought to build a great palace for himself called the Golden Palace. And he asked a Roman senator, or a senior senator by the name of Licinius Apollonius, to appoint the world's greatest stonemason to be the project manager for his Golden Palace. Now, this man at this time would have been in his 60s. And so Licinius Apollonius appointed this particular man whom Jesus had healed to be his project manager for Nero's Golden Palace. Now, that's where the good part began. Because Jonathan still remembered how Jesus had given him a new lease on life, had shown how God was not his enemy, had shown that God loved him. Now, Nero at this time was beginning his persecution of the Christians. And so what Jonathan did, with the permission of Licinius Apollonius, the Roman senator, he convinced Nero to leave Jonathan alone. Don't even go to the site to inspect it, because it was going to be such a great, magnificent structure that it was going to be a surprise to Nero. And so Nero agreed. That's a good idea. And so as Jonathan began to build, and he built this great, magnificent structure to Nero, and it was a golden palace. I mean, it was beautiful. It was the greatest palace ever built by a Roman emperor, or to a Roman emperor, by a Roman emperor. But Jonathan did something. He built right underneath the main foyer, the main entry foyer of Nero's palace into the main living quarters. He built a huge room underneath. This room was as larger than this church. And in this room was a secret chamber that even Nero didn't know anything about. And Jonathan built that with the instructions of Licinius Apollonius to be a facility so that the Christians could worship God. In the very palace of Nero himself, this man who was killing the Christians daily, within his own palace, hundreds of Christians were able to worship God. And there's never one single record of any Christian who was taken out from the time that they were worshiping to go into persecution or to be killed in the games, persecution games. They were taken from the streets, they were taken from their homes, they were taken from their jobs, but their worship was never disturbed. Nero never did realize that there was a room underneath his palace. And this is what happened. With the third day that Nero was in his palace, the third day, he woke up in the middle of the night screaming and pulling his hair out. And he told his servants, he says, "The walls are screaming at me." They said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "The walls are singing, and they're singing about this Jesus who we are persecuting through the people. We're killing his followers, and my walls are screaming and singing to him." And he appealed to the Senate, and the Senate thought he was crazy. His family thought he was crazy. But every night, he would run through the house, pulling his hair and beating his breast because he felt like his walls were singing about Jesus, when in reality, right underneath his feet, the Christians were praising Jesus. And it was this man who Jesus healed on this day who was responsible for the construction of that room. Nero finally went insane because he couldn't convince anyone that his walls were singing to him. He eventually went insane, and he cut his throat or stabbed himself at the throat and committed suicide. And so, God, if you can say this in a diplomatic way, God had the last laugh. So the consequences of the miracles of Jesus just didn't stop with this miracle. They went on. And in our lives today, when our Lord does great things for us, it just doesn't stop with that. It goes on and on and on, and it has consequences perhaps for generations thereafter. If you're in a position to where you have been hurt by a pastor, by another Christian, or been hurt by the fact that you felt like that God should have answered your prayer, He didn't. Or should have answered it at 5 o'clock and He didn't answer it until 10 o'clock when it was too late. And you feel like that God let you down. Go back to this miracle and realize that God does not hate you. He's not punishing you. Many times our lives are the results of victimization that God does love us.
And that concludes today's teaching with Dr. Ron Charles of the Cubit Foundation. If you've been blessed by today's message, you can order more life-changing teachings in the form of DVDs, ebooks, hard copy books, and CDs by going online to www.cubitfoundation.org. That's www.cubitfoundation.org. Or you can call 770-207-0051. That's 770-207-0051. If you would like to become a supporting pillar of the Cubit Foundation, you can mail your tax-deductible contribution to P.O. Box 1316, Monroe, Georgia 30655. That's P.O. Box 1316, Monroe, Georgia 30655. Thank you for listening to Dr. Ron Charles of the Cubit Foundation, and may God bless you.